Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo. I'm the founding partner at Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency advisory firm that's really focused on helping solve Africa's complex development challenges. Now, if you walk into any gathering of young Africans today, in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Harare, the conversation very quickly finds its way sooner or later to living. The frustration behind that conversation is personal and entirely rational and understandable. But my guest today has spent years asking a harder question, not why people leave, but what their leaving does to the country they leave behind. What happens to a democracy when its most educated, most politically engaged citizens decide that living is more rational than staying to fight? Her answer is quite unsettling. Authoritarian regimes do not merely survive the departure of their strongest opponents. They are strengthened by it. Nearly 4 million Zimbabweans emigrated as the economy collapsed. At the same time, an AIDS pandemic removed an entire cohort of would-be opposition voters before they could even cast a vote. The opposition in Zimbabwe was not simply defeated at the polls, it was hollowed out demographically long before polling day even arrived. If that mechanism is real, and if it travels beyond Zimbabwe, then it changes how we read political survival across the entire continent. The deepest threat to an opposition may no longer be losing an election. It may be losing its voters, one departure, one death at a time. Dr. Chipo Dendere is a political scientist in the Africana Studies Department at Wellesley College in the United States, where her work focuses on democratization, elections, voting behavior, migration, and the politics of social media across Africa. Born in Zimbabwe, she got her doctorate at Georgia State University, and before academia, she worked at the World Bank, the Carter Center, and Oxfam. Her new book, very important book from Cambridge University Press, is Death, Diversion, and Departure: Voter Exit and the Persistence of Authoritarianism in Zimbabwe. It is, to my mind, one of the most original contributions to the study of African governance in recent years. Chipo, welcome to Development Discourse.
Thank you. I'm really excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to it.
Same here, same here. Now, but before we get into the architecture of the argument, was there a moment, maybe a conversation, a place, an event, when you first sensed that the story of Zimbabwe's politics could not be told through what happened just at the ballot box?
Absolutely. So for those of you who are listening, who might be thinking of graduate school or getting your PhD or what have you, I was in graduate school, and at the time I was studying American politics. So I was initially trained as an Americanist. And and one of the things I kept thinking about is how the US has had many, presidents, right? We're at 47 right now. And I was looking at the region in Southern Africa. And one of the things that kept gnawing at me was Zimbabwe at that time had only had one president. And the literature, which I have a great deal of respect for, would tell us that, Zimbabwe's politics or African politics primarily driven by violence, right? So politicians use violence and that depresses turnout or that shapes how people will vote. And I was thinking, yeah, sure, violence, but what else, right? What else is influencing voters? So I went to the continent. My advisor at the time, Dano Yang, said, if you really want to understand a place, just go. Go not as a researcher, go not as you're going back home, just go as an observer. So I studied in South Africa. I spent time in Cape Town. I spent time in Johannesburg, and then I took a bus from Cape Town through Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania to Kenya, by bus. And those of us who've traveled by bus on the continent, you know that our buses shake, right? I didn't have a lot of money, so I was taking whatever chicken bus I could get. At least that's what we call them in Southern Africa, chicken buses.
Yeah.
And for me, it was this movement of people. So every border we got to, there were just hundreds of people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people crossing the border. And I was raised by a trader. So then I talked to my mother about, well, what was it like crossing the border? And one of the things she casually pointed out was that, well, we would cross to South Africa, we would do our business, and then we would cross back. But what you're noticing right now is a lot of crossing into South Africa and people not coming back.
Mm.
And as somebody who had left home myself to go and study in the US, I had never really thought of what that meant, right? That in the early 2000s, everyone was leaving. In high school, you could just wake up and half our teachers had left. And for me, then it was, and at the time we would talk about, oh, people have died because of HIV, or somebody has gone to the UK, or somebody is now a teacher in South Africa. But it was really in graduate school where I started thinking, well, what is this? And then I read Hirschman Exit and Voice, where on page 7, and I always tell people that it was the page 7, I was reading it for an exam on American politics. And he was talking about how the early pilgrims to the US were these progressives, right, in England and elsewhere in Europe. And they were the types of people that the monarchy didn't want because they were anti-monarchy, they were pro-democracy, they were anti the king. They didn't want any of that. They wanted elections. They wanted a different type of governance. And so for the king, it was like, yeah, go. Like, you want to go to America, go to America. And for me, it was this light bulb moment of, okay, they left. And then what happens, right? And in the interim, it was helpful to the monarchy at the time because now you're left with people that agree with you. So that was, I mean, it's a long answer to it, but there were all these different pieces. But I think reading Hirschman really got me like, oh, yes, somebody has written about this, but we haven't applied this to the African continent. Like, we're thinking about the youth bulge, we're thinking about Africa has the fastest growing population. But then I started thinking, but where is the population? What is on the minds of people? Like in Zimbabwe, everybody wants a passport. Everybody wants, like, one of our most functional offices is the passport office. And people will pay, at one point, Zimbabweans were paying $300 for a passport.
Which is multiples of what they earn.
Which is multiples of what people earn.
Yeah. Well, anyways, I mean, and we're going to get to Hirschman because what I see is that you've extended the Hirschman argument, with new evidence and analysis. But let's even go to the core idea. Most analysis of a regime like the ZANU-PF, would focus on what it does to voters, right? The violence, the patronage system, the rigging. You argue that the more important story is what happens to voters before any of that. Yeah. Your core argument is that the regime enjoys what you call a voter exit premium, right? Can you unpack this idea for like someone who's hearing it for the first time?
Yeah, so one of the things I say is that imagine that you're in a country with 100 voters, right? So there are 100 voters, 50 of them support the ruling party, 50 of them support the opposition. HIV was not discriminatory in the sense that HIV didn't say, oh, you get HIV if you support the ruling party, or you get HIV if you support the opposition. But the pattern that it did have is that it was localized by region. So certain areas were more likely to have HIV than other areas. And in the Zimbabwe case, the opposition's base was in the urban areas. So you might say to yourself, 40% of the people that support the opposition live in urban areas. So those places get hit by HIV, right? And it's, again, not discriminatory. HIV isn't saying I'm hitting you because you are supporting the opposition. It is that you're in this location. And then we start thinking about who's likely to leave. So the economy is failing, right? So you've got Zimbabwe is at the time a growing economy with lots of young professionals, a growing middle class, a growing working class. And who are the first groups of people to leave? It's not necessarily people in rural areas. They might move into urban areas, but within the urban context is where you're getting most of the people that are getting the opportunities. Someone says, I'm going to England to be a nurse. So in the 2000s now, the UK is looking for nurses. And where do they get the nurses? Well, Zimbabwe has a lot of well-trained nurses. They speak English. They are familiar with the British system because of colonialism. And so one nurse from Zimbabwe goes to England. They write to their friends, hey, friends, they need more nurses. So overnight, you've got a hospital that loses 20, 30 people. Same thing with teachers. Teachers, one teacher moves to South Africa, goes to a school that is in need of teachers. This is post 1994. South Africa is rebuilding itself. It's expanding education. They really, really need teachers, right? And so those teachers go. So it is this idea for me, and what reviewers initially struggled with was, well, but the government didn't create the exit. And I'm like, yeah, they didn't physically move people. But what happens is that the government benefits from something they didn't create at all. And so if you're the government, you could do one of two things. So what governments like Egypt and others in the earlier times did was to close the borders and say, you can't leave. We're going to make it very difficult for you to leave. And the Zimbabwean government was sort of like, you want to leave, go. What we're going to do is to make revenue from the passports and the passport office, and in some ways facilitate for you to leave. So for the government, it's that you want to leave, leave. Like, and I don't even think that they were aware that in this way of people leaving, they are going to benefit at the polls. In fact, the government had done some gerrymandering, some local gerrymandering, right, of moving urban voters to rural areas and things like that, but they had not thought about moving people out of the country. I mean, no government really plans to do that. But this outward movement happens, and it happens. And I think the time that it happens is really critical. It happens at a time when the finally have a very strong opposition in Zimbabwe, an opposition that's finally mobilizing, especially urbanites. And those urbanites that the opposition is mobilizing are the same urbanites that are seeing opportunities to leave, and then they leave.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And now, so most of the theory you're building up here seems to be based on Albert Hirschman's exit voice and loyalty, right? But in his framework, exit weakens voice. What did Hirschman miss that your Zimbabwean data forced you to add?
Yeah, so I think for starters, I don't think Hirschman was thinking of Africa at all
Yeah.
in his work, even in his subsequent work, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things though with the Zimbabwean diaspora is that exit did not necessarily weaken voice. So as people left, we initially saw the independent newspapers that propped up online. So a lot of journalists left, they created online newspapers. There was a lot of activism at embassies, all of this stuff that's happening with citizen voice and saying we're going to keep the conversation alive. What I was interested in is, okay, so you keep the voice alive, but as long as you can't go back to vote and your vote can't be counted at the ballot, then there's that weakening, right, that happens. And then for Hirschman, it was that exit is also about shifting loyalties. And I was pushing back and saying, well, just because people have left, it doesn't mean that they're no longer loyal to the country. And
Exactly.
my measure of loyalty was not just in people keeping the conversation alive on online blogs and online engagement and protests and all of that was happening abroad, but the other measure of loyalty that I thought was actually hard on democracy is that people sent back money home. Right. So I know this is true too in Nigeria, that after somebody has moved abroad, the first phone call you get from relatives is, hey, how you doing? Maybe they might not even say how you doing. They'll just say, so I need 500 naira or I need 500 US
Exactly.
dollars for this. And with the Zimbabwean diaspora, that loyalty, right? The loyalty to family, the loyalty to country really played out in remitting back to the home country. And I think Hirschman would not have anticipated that once people left, they kept this connection. I think for him, it was like once you left, you left. And that was the end of that.
And indeed, you're right. And what you explain, kind of applies to almost every African country that's got a large diaspora, out there. They've got voice online. They also send monies home through remittances, etc. But let's go to a part of, what you said about the book. You said the part of the book that you're proudest of is the link between the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the ZANU-PF's survival, like a connection you found almost entirely missing in all of these other literature. Can you walk us through it? Like how does a public health catastrophe become a political asset for the very government presiding over it?
Yeah, so this comes to me first in 2010. I'd gone back home because my young sister had passed away the year before. So I went back to visit her grave, as we do. And when I was standing at the grave, I noticed something that's peculiar. Well, now it's not as peculiar, right? Because cholera, COVID, all of these things have changed how we do burial on the continent. But in Zimbabwe, we used to have, I think, quite strict laws or traditions and customs in the sense that older people were buried on one side and babies, children were buried kind of far away. And these two did not meet. But as I was standing at this grave, I started looking around me and I'm seeing that, a 3-year-old is buried next to a 26-year-old or 30-year-old or 40-year-old or 60-year-old and all of that. But it was also the ages of who was dying, right, on the continent. My sister, when she passed, she was only 23.
Wow.
And she's surrounded by other 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 18-year-olds. And I think my other sister thought I was crazy because I had my notebook on me and I start walking around just taking note of what are these age groups, right? Who are these people that have died? And then in conversation with family, people are like, well, we had the HIV crisis and many people died. And everybody had talked about the impact of HIV on, actually, nobody had really talked about the impact of HIV on politics, but we had talked about its impact on the workforce, right? So
Mhm.
that the people that were dying from HIV were young, they were between the ages of 18 and 35. Second to that is people were thinking that a lot of, there was all this literature on Africans in rural areas are dying of HIV. But what I know and what I knew, right, and everybody in Southern Africa understood this, it was that a lot of urbanites would get sick in urban areas and then they might die in the rural area and be buried there. But they were
Mhm.
urbanites. So here you've got this workforce that's dying. They're educated, right? Zimbabwe has invested a lot in educating people. And I got interested in a friend's family, where there were 8 siblings, all of them, 8 siblings, all went through University of Zimbabwe at its prime. And I was talking to their mother and their father who were saying their biggest heartbreak is that they educated their 8 children. And
Mm.
they did all the right things that they were supposed to do, right? So you get educated, you get your nice little house in the suburbs, but all 8 children died of HIV and left orphans, each one
Mm.
leaving 3 or 4 children. And at the time, it was called short, long-term illness. And then I
Mhm.
started looking through and I was thinking, okay, so what's happening with the politicians themselves? There was a time when Zimbabwe was losing a lot of politicians, not just Zimbabwe, but Zambia as well, South Africa as well. And to his credit, I have to say, Robert Mugabe and Nelson Mandela were the first 2 leaders on the continent to name HIV. And Robert
Mm.
Mugabe named it for his ministers. And he said, there's this illness that's killing all of you. And he named it, right? And then he would go on to invest almost very quickly on HIV. And in the book, I talk about why I was so confused by the ZANU-PF policies that kind of went back on that
Mhm.
investment with Operation Rambachina. But it really was at my sister's grave, and I was thinking, and she, on paper, she died from meningitis, but
Mhm.
meningitis is tied to HIV. And
Mhm.
as a young girl, she was 22, she was very beautiful. And I started thinking about this framework of older men dating younger women. And not just because this is what had happened with my sister, but it is something that we had seen. And, now a lot of young people will have seen The Polygamist and will have seen the case of Lindani and Gomorrah. And when I was watching this last week and taking my own notes, and I was saying, this young generation doesn't remember that era where we talked so casually about sugar daddies and the fact that so you had the older men and younger women dying. And in the lucky with the generation of older women or like middle-aged women,
Mhm.
those are the ones who were surviving the HIV pandemic. But then the question came to me that, so what happens to a country when you're young, your workforce, you're educated, they die. You've invested in their education, you've prepared them for the workforce. So either they take that education and they go abroad, or in the case of Southern Africa, that education, those skill sets die with them. And
Mm.
so the United Nations has done a very good job of keeping track of where people were dying. So I was able to actually look at voting returns from particular locations and say, okay, so if these people had lived, knowing what we know about the type of political participation of these groupings of people, what would it look like? And we know that ZANU-PF strongholds, which are rural areas, were not
Well,
losing people at the same rate from HIV, but it was urban areas. And then something else that I looked at in comparing the MPs, right? So opposition and ZANU-PF were both losing MPs to HIV because, again, HIV wasn't discriminating in urban
right.
areas and saying, well, you support ZANU-PF, so I'm not going to kill you. But the problem for the opposition is that each time they lost an MP due to HIV and there was a runoff election or there was a by-election to replace that person, usually ZANU-PF would win because, as we know, incumbent parties are better at winning by-elections. They have the strategy, the resources, they're kind of ready to go. But younger parties they also just don't have the manpower. So at
The
one
reason.
point, I think Zimbabwe loses 17 MPs. And while I was looking at the Zimbabwe case, because a good book, you have to be able to see, does the story travel outside my own country? So I was
Mhm.
looking at Zambia very closely, and somebody had done a small study on MP deaths in Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And in all of these cases, you were seeing this pattern where it was easier for the ruling party to replace their own people and then to take the seats of the opposition once somebody died from. And at the time, again, it was long, short illness. No one's death certificate really said HIV or AIDS, but at least the medical
Sure.
people would say to me, that's a good proxy for HIV.
Sure. Now, a careless reading of your book may leave one thinking that, okay, the ZANU-PF understood that this was thinning out the opposition numbers and maybe just let it run. But that's not what you're arguing. But I want to introduce a second side to it, which is the same collapse that killed opposition-leaning voters also created or should have created opposition sentiment amongst the survivors, so like grief, anger, against the ZANU-PF. Couldn't the pandemic have mobilized as many people as it removed, such that they vote against the ZANU-PF? How do you net that out?
Yeah, in the region, and I don't want to underplay that citizen protest to HIV. In fact, this is a question, it's a good question because it's the first question I was asked at the University of Cape Town, where people were saying, well, yeah, you're almost saying that people were not protesting HIV. But here's the problem with HIV. It was an illness that people did not want to talk about.
Mm,
It's an illness that people did not want to talk about. And in West Africa, for a while, I was trying to understand, well, why was the disease so detrimental in Southern Africa than in West Africa? And I had all these arguments about post-independence euphoria. But for a different project that I'm working on PEPFAR, it turns out that West Africa and Southern Africa, we had a very different strand of the illness. Right. So you can kind of put that aside because you might say, well, why don't we see the same death rates in Nigeria and the same social issues in Nigeria or Ghana or other parts of the continent? So in Southern Africa, because the illness is so closely tied to promiscuity, sexual behavior, it's not something that people wanted to talk about, right? It's a disease where you blame the person for having it.
mm,
And so whatever, and so there was a lot of moralizing, right? And ZANU-PF did come out in 2005 and say, well, the problem with urban areas, why we have so much of HIV is because you are promiscuous. So we
mm,
are going to clean up the city. So that's where Operation Rambatrina comes in. We're going to clean up the city because you are promiscuous. This is a disease of promiscuity. And so we want to clean up the cities and move people to rural areas, to this and that, which I think at that point is the only time where I can think of the government thinking about it as gerrymandering and wanting to move people. But I think
mm,
that the big challenge with HIV, then the other thing is that the governments came in with the solution. So there isn't a country at that time where HIV medication or HIV treatment was done by independent sectors. It was all government sector. So now the
mhm,
government, they're coming in as the heroes, which they were. And again, I think Zimbabwe was at the forefront. So Zimbabwe is able to deal with HIV much faster than our neighbors in Botswana, in Lesotho, in South Africa. And come in and say, okay, these are the processes that we have, new start centers, all of this education. But citizens, I don't think really felt that they could blame the government for this
mm,
because
mm.
of the nature of the illness, right? Where
Yeah.
and I guess even for me, the problem on TV sometimes is that people were talking about the promiscuity of HIV as being the problem. And
Mm.
even as children. So I remember when I first came to college in the US, and I was talking to my college friends and saying, because Americans seemed to me to be more sexually liberated. And I was saying to my college friends, aren't you guys worried about getting HIV? And they sort of looked at me with AIDS, because we grew up, right? Our generation with you have to abstain, you have to be careful because there is HIV. And the way you get HIV is from sexualized behavior,
Mm.
and we do not normalize. So even thinking about condom usage, all of that, at least in Southern Africa, it was very, very strict, right? Like HIV is bad, sex is bad. People who get HIV engage in bad sex behavior. And
Mhm.
so that kind of framing of the public health crisis,
Mhm.
it made it very difficult, I think, even for political campaigning, because then it would be like, well, what are you campaigning against exactly? Or what are
Exactly.
you campaigning for?
Exactly. But there's another pandemic, right, that we can look at. So if a health crisis can reshape an electorate, then COVID, should have done it across Africa, right? So if you look at Tanzania, for instance, Magufuli denied the virus existed, discouraged testing and vaccines, and his party, the CCM, is still in power. So is it that your thesis is playing out here in real time? And what should African policymakers be watching for in the next pandemic or in the next climate-driven health shock or even in weaponized poverty for what it means for enduring politics?
Yeah, so I finished the book in 2021, 2022, at the height of COVID. And I was really, and at the time I wrote a small piece for the conversation because we were all worried, right, that Africa would see massive deaths because of our weakened healthcare system. And
Mm-hmm.
thank God, knock on wood, I think COVID did not decimate us. Where I'm looking right now is the Ebola crisis. What does that look
Okay.
like for the DRC? Because I think Ebola is closer to HIV in the
Yes.
virality of it and how quickly it looks. But I think any time where African governments can come in as the saviors of the day, which they did with COVID, some doing better than others. But with COVID, I think there was also a lot of pushback, right, with protests because people didn't like the lockdowns, people were losing money, they were doing, and so governments, African governments in some ways were much more loose with COVID restrictions than you saw in the United States. I had been really worried watching New York City, for example, and thinking, well, what does it mean with all of these progressive cities being the ones that are being most hard hit by HIV? And the theory didn't pan out in the US because what happened with HIV is that, with COVID, is that Trump would actually lose, right? And Joe Biden would come in. But then 4 years later, Trump is back. And so you could think about maybe there was an immediate reaction to people saying the government didn't handle COVID well, but then Democrats get punished on the economy. So, and functioning democracies are a little bit harder to look at. But I do think anytime that African governments can come out as the hero is
Mm.
important. Something else that I'm looking at is the crisis, the migration crisis in South Africa. It's not a pandemic, if you will, but I think there is something happening socially there. And we've seen ANC being restrained, right? So they're not really going after the protesters, but they're also not speaking out equivocally on anti-immigration. And so I think they're hedging their bets there.
Mhm.
And for
Mhm.
the other African governments like Malawi, Ghana, all these places that are bringing back their migrants, where the question I think should have been from every single African at this moment is, well, the reason why people are leaving home is because you have failed on the economy, you failed on the politics. But look, the Ghanaian government are looking like heroes right now. It's a
Mhm.
migration crisis, but they look like heroes because they are bringing people back. The Malawian government is looking like heroes because they sent 70 buses to get their people. And for me, it's like, okay, that's good. You're saving people from xenophobia. But the reason the people left in the first
In the
place was
first place.
because of
Mhm.
your bad economic policies. And
Mhm.
so anytime that our governments get to look like heroes, then they win, especially the ruling parties. They just win. As you said in Tanzania, they handled it very badly, but they were able to go back to people and say, look, we managed. My other favorite example that doesn't come up in the book as much is Uganda. So Uganda
Mm.
was actually very clear. Museveni was very clear in saying this. I am the reason that the World Bank, PEPFAR, everybody is here to help with HIV. If you don't vote for me, like there's a really good clip in one of the World Bank documentaries where he says, if you don't vote for me, all their help and their money will go away.
Mm-hmm.
So I am the reason that they are here. And it's like, okay, but people still want democracy. And then for the voter, it becomes, well, if we don't vote for Museveni, then all these good things will go away. And I was just
Yeah.
engaging with people from Uganda for the last election because I was stunned by looking at how people were voting and what I thought was less support for Bobby Wine than I had expected. And somebody
Mm-hmm.
was like, well, ultimately, people are thinking also, well, will all the things that we have go away?
Mm-hmm.
So
And
African governments are good at playing hero.
yeah, and we'll get to that, but I want to push your theory a little bit one more time, to say, is it possible that the problem isn't the migration at all? Yeah. Maybe it's the disenfranchisement. So if you think about the 4 million in the book from Zimbabwe, let's assume that these people who are leaving, that they also have the ability to vote from the diaspora, right? So you're not subtracting the 4 million, they still can vote. Is voter exit really the mechanism, or is it a mechanism that deliberately, through legal choice, locks out the diaspora from the ballot? And we find this in Nigeria and so many other countries. So is it migration, or is it that the diaspora do not have the ability to vote?
So that's why I was very careful to use the word exit, right? It's
Okay.
any form of exit. So you've got Kenya, for example, which people thought would be a good contrast to my book because they just allowed external voting. But
Yes.
what we know is that the moment people leave, there are higher chances of them not voting than voting. And as I walk people through in the book to say that even when you're in country, voting is complicated. Voting
Mm-hmm.
is expensive, right? So
So many
I'm not
factors.
just talking like I could be in Harare right now and voting can still be cumbersome. The idea of going to register to vote, then spending time in line, et cetera, et cetera. Democracy is not cheap. Democracy is also not very exciting for most people. I think there are very few people like me who go to Harare and I'll stand in line for 10 hours and I'll be enjoying myself standing in line for voting. For most people, it's I'm going through the motions to do this. So,
Mhm.
given the high bar, now somebody has moved to Manchester. If the only voting poll, even if it was in London, right, at the embassy, because usually governments will say, well, we can't allow external voting because where are they going to be voting? Where is the Zimbabwean soil? And the Zimbabwean soil is at the embassy in London. So let's
Mhm.
say the government had allowed people to vote at the embassy in London. Somebody's in Manchester, right? So this is what I walk the reader through in the book, that the fatigue of just being abroad. And
Mhm.
most immigrants work, I don't know, 10, 12, 14
Jobs, yeah,
hours a day.
yeah.
And then the question of how do I spend my resources? So the pushback from the Zimbabwean government has always been, we haven't disenfranchised the diaspora. Anybody can come back home and vote. And as you see through the book, I say, well, there are many ways to force people to exit. You're forcing
Exactly.
people to exit locally by making voter registration difficult. And I think this is something that applies to Nigeria, right? Where it's
Exactly.
like the cost of getting the voter ID card, not just in Nigeria, but across the board, right? The cost of getting whatever you need, the voter ID card for you to be able to vote. If that's too high, then you lose people.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
here's somebody in the diaspora. Maybe they can vote in London, like Kenyans can vote in Washington, D.C. People are not, most people are unlikely to spend $500 to fly from Texas to Washington, D.C. to vote.
Exactly.
And why the exit argument for me really made sense was Mexico. Mexico is right across the border from the United States. Mexican citizens in the US can also vote from the US for Mexican elections, but that turnout is very, very low. So
Mhm.
if Mexicans who are right across the border are not voting in the elections, right? What about Zimbabweans or other Africans where the continent is even further? And for
Mhm.
Mexican voters, there were voting stations right across the US. It wasn't just in Washington, D.C., it was spread all over. We've just seen the election for Colombia, and Colombia allows external voting from the diaspora. And I
Hmm.
think you can even do it electronically. It's not very difficult. But the rate of voting for the diaspora was very low. My other favorite example is France. With France, you don't even need to vote yourself. I could give you permission. If my brother and I could say, oh, my brother is going to vote for me, and I give you permission to vote on my behalf, right? They have such a weird system that allows for this. And yet we know that once people have exited, right? So as long as there are conditions that allow for exit from
Mm.
a voting locale, people are not going back. And in the US, this is a functioning democracy. One of the challenges is college students. And I look at it and I say, most college students go to college far away from their home, right? Same in Nigeria. Most kids will come to Lagos from the north or wherever. And if at election time they have their voter ID card, but if the cost is to go back home to vote. And remember, politicians don't make elections particularly
Easy.
convenient for people.
Yeah.
The dates they choose, the months they choose, the times they choose, all of this is very inconvenient for people.
Yeah.
It's all very inconvenient. So even with the Zimbabwe vote, the last election in 2023, I flew back to Zimbabwe to vote, but they did not decide on the date until almost 2 months before the election.
Mm.
So how many people are going to fly back? Or even, and then how many people will fly to Washington, D.C., even if it's happening in the US? How many people
Mm.
are going to fly from Washington, D.C., or even drive from New York City to Washington, D.C. 3 times just to be able to register to vote? The government has changed the date, they've changed the times, they've changed who can vote. So again, anytime that governments benefit from things that push people out, we can think about it, whether it's migration, we can think
Yeah.
about illness. Like, with the HIV, I say it wasn't just the people that were dying, that were exiting the political system. It was the fatigue of caregivers. Because
Mm.
taking care of somebody who's got HIV is an on the clock type of job. And
Mm.
I think most young voters, even some of the people my age in our late 30s and 40s, don't remember what it's like to care for people with HIV. But I do remember because my family, because my mother is the oldest daughter, and I think most of us were raised by oldest daughters, our houses became makeshift hospitals, right? Because the hospital is saying there's nothing we can do for somebody who has HIV. So then they're brought home. You've got them in the cottage or wherever you've got them in the cottage, but somebody has to be there 24/7. You have to
Mm.
bathe people. You have to feed people. You have to clean people. You have to do all of this 24/7. And the idea of then participating in politics, and in fact, one of the things I noticed for women caregivers in particular is that they were leaving the workforce. So
Mhm.
forget participating in politics, they were leaving the workforce where they get paid. They were
Mm.
leaving those jobs to become full-time caregivers. So
So,
this idea of exit, it's anytime you can think about pushing or attrition of voters, right?
yeah. So let's think again about how this theory travels to other African countries. Let me bring in Nigeria and the Japa phenomenon. Yeah. Your thesis is really about, situations where you've got like a dominant party, a dominant party struggling for survival. Nigeria isn't quite yet a dominant party state, although we're hurtling down that slope. But at least in 2015, there was a switch from PDP to APC, so you can say we still have a robust political competition. So when young Nigerians leave by their hundreds of thousands, what we call Japa in Nigeria, is that really a voter exit premium story, given that we're not a dominant party story either? Does your model apply in the Nigerian situation?
It does. And I think if people had trusted me more, I would not have even put the word authoritarianism in the title. I would have just said voter exit is bad for democracy. That's what I was trying to do. But
Mm.
this is the first of its kind book. And I'm hoping that other young people looking at it will say, well, Chipo limits this to authoritarian states or where a party has been in power for a long time. But these patterns are evident everywhere, right? Where we're thinking about a stock of Democrats or a stock of voters that are lost from a system and what that means for democratic engagement. On one hand, in a place like Nigeria, it might mean that politics becomes about focusing on just the voters that people can see, the voters that they think can participate. So both parties can benefit from this, right? They can benefit from it by just jostling with whoever they think they can get to the polls and subsequently ignoring the voices of the millions of Nigerians that are not in the country. So if it had been up to me, I would have done that. But the thing with this kind of a theory building book is that for it to work, you almost have to be narrow with the first book.
Very narrow.
You have to be very narrow. And I'm thinking one of the books that I always have in my office that motivated me was a book by Magaloni, which was looking at how in Mexico, the PRI had survived. And her theory was very simple. They built this oversized coalition. And they made it such that if you want to be anyone in politics in Mexico, you had to join the PRI. And I think this is a theory that travels everywhere, right? We're seeing it in the US right now. Yesterday, there were all these conversations among Democrats on whether Mamdani's people are abusing the Democrats and all of this. It's all about this big coalition. But that book is so narrow. But because it's so narrow, it helps us to pinpoint the way that a mechanism works. So with Zimbabwe, we're able to kind of hold a lot of things steady and say, here's a country where we have ZANU-PF that's been in power since 1980. We've got the MDC at the time that's been in power since from 1999 to 2013. And even in the book, I'm very careful not to talk past 2013 because I wanted us to hold these two things constant. So you've got the MDC, they're popular, they've galvanized the urbanites, they've got the working class, and in Zimbabwe, which you don't do in Nigeria, you don't really talk about race, right? But for us, the white voters and the black voters and the Indian voters, all of that really matters. So we're saying the MDC has managed to revive the white voters who had stopped participating in politics after the 1980s. And the Asian voters who tend to be the business owners, they've galvanized all of these people and they have managed to penetrate the rural areas because this is something that the opposition struggled with. And we're holding these two things constant for the book. And still, even with all of this, the opposition cannot win. And so some people come in and say, well, it's the violence. And then you look at the opposition and you say, well, it is the violence, but the violence isn't stopping opposition supporters from going to the polls. So it can't just be violence. They get bitter and they show up at the polls. The actual issue is that the numbers that are showing up at the polls are not enough. They are not enough to be rig-proof. Right. So when you're thinking about places where you've got a dominant party, right, whether it's a dominant party in Zimbabwe, it's the ANC, it's whoever, the opposition doesn't need to just win with 50+1. They need to win with at least 60% of the vote, which is something that we call the rig-proof margin, right? You need to win with enough so that someone cannot cheat. And we can all look at it and say, this was more than, and this was the problem in the 2008 election, where ZANU-PF came back and said, well, actually the opposition won, but the opposition won with 48% of the vote. So if they had gained 2 more percent, then they would, you see what I'm, so in actuality, I think maybe the opposition got 51%, not enough to be quite rig-proof. Because when you're at 48 or 51, somebody can take a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, and you end up where you end up. And you notice, right, so ZANU-PF, when they win in particular areas, they like to win big. And they'll say, we got 50,000 more votes in this area. And you're looking at it like, really? But then it's rig-proof. It's almost difficult to go back and recount. So my hope with this idea about voter exit is for us to then think about where can we loosen these conditions that I made in the book that needed to be very strict for purposes of the book, but can we loosen them up? Can we think about why Peter Obi would have lost in the last election? Where was his voter base? Who was his voter base? Did they show up to the polls? If they didn't show up to the polls, why didn't they show up to the polls? What caused their exit, right? Why didn't the Nigerians? Because the one thing about Nigerians is you're all over the world. I think, you're all over the world. Why is it that Nigerians that are abroad, that are vocal about politics, that care about politics, that are educated? I mean, you go to New York City, half the doctors, the black doctors that you meet are Nigerian or Ghanaian. Why is it that these doctors are not going back to vote? And if they had gone back to vote, would it have made a difference for Peter Obi? If we are thinking truly about moving Nigerian politics to the next step, not just this back and forth between the same players. So do we have the same players that are constantly winning, right? So when the opposition wins, it's the same players. When the other party wins, it's the same players. How do we change it so that it's not the same players? Where are the missing voters? And so, if that's kind of where I would go next with this work, is thinking about where are the missing voters and who are they?
And why, despite all the excitement about a candidate, just about 35% of the registered voters show up to vote. Yeah. And then you narrow the room for, or you make it possible for all kinds of shenanigans, to be played against you. But I think you raise a very important point about the diaspora. So you've got the large Nigerian diaspora in the US, in London, etc. You've already talked about how difficult it is for them to come home to vote. But is there something else that they can do? Or are they part of the problem? And let me unpack this a little bit. So there's substantial body of work arguing that remittances actually reduce demand for accountability by cushioning households, leading people to tolerate governance that, without the remittances, maybe they would have fought harder against, right? On that account, if the diaspora's money isn't a counterweight to the regime, in fact, it may even be a subsidy for the regime's survival by propping up the economy, keeping foreign exchange flowing. Is it possible that the diaspora is, without knowing it, without meaning it, helping to keep alive the very government that we expect that they should bring greater voice, in at least keeping accountable?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in two ways. One of the most mind-blowing things I came across in my interviews was that, so for the Zimbabwean diaspora, I don't want to speak for the Nigerian diaspora, but for the Zimbabwean diaspora, women send more money than men.
Okay.
Perhaps I can speak across the continent. Women send more than men. So the women sending money would then say to me, well, I'm sending money to my children, but I don't want them to participate in politics. I want them to be safe, right? So remember those arguments about politics is violent, politics is this. And then the mothers would say, well, if I'm already sending you money, why do you need to go out and protest? And so in other countries, like in Latin America and in India, they talk about this idea of remitting democracy. That when you send money, it usually comes with the message of, I've sent you money. Now you need to participate. You need to do this. And I don't think, and in the book, I'm very careful with the language I use, which is to say that the mothers that I spoke to were remitting caution. So they're saying to their children, I don't want you to necessarily participate in this. And then I followed up with the children, many of them adult children. And again, people engage in politics if they are worried about economic issues. When those economic issues are solved, their willingness to participate can be diminished, which is why the middle class is very important, right? Because the middle class, they're teachers, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're nurses, but their wealth is dependent on their participation in a political system, on taxation, on earning a paycheck, on all of that. But if you're getting, say, $500 a month from your mother who's abroad, and you're not necessarily working, and there are no consequences that would lead you to lose this money. So even if the government plays around with the currency, the taxation, all of that, you're still getting the money, right? So I found that the people that were receiving money in Zimbabwe were less likely to participate in politics than those that were not receiving money. And I saw this among the youth, just very different political behavior between young people that were getting money and young people that were not getting money. And then this isn't in the book, but this is something that Zimbabweans have come at me with, because afterwards I started to realize a pattern where now the diaspora themselves, some people in the diaspora, well, actually, I think I'm very honest in the book that I say about 17% of the diaspora that I spoke to were supportive of ZANU-PF. And what happened is after Robert Mugabe left, that support just shot up. It just shot up. And on one hand, it's people in the diaspora thinking that if they support ZANU-PF, they're going to have access to land or tax deals or all of this. So could I write the same book today? I could, but I would have to be very careful because that diaspora has also changed. And whether it is the conditions of living abroad that's making people look back home and thinking, or it's opportunistic and people looking and thinking, if I want to be in business on the continent, then I have to gel with the government. And in fact, you know what's been really interesting is I'm doing some other work, and ZANU-PF people come to me all the time and they'll say, well, let's sit down and have an engagement with the academic. And it's the opposition that sometimes says, we don't want to talk to you. And so there's a lot that's happening on the continent where now the diaspora, when I'm talking to them, almost most of the business people I'm talking to, it's no longer let's fight for the opposition to win or let's fight for democracy. It's, well, you know, if I want the business permits, then I need to talk to Minister so and so. It's almost like, you know, Chinua Achebe could come and write this story, right? It's a man of the people all over again. And so, you know, when people say, could you write this book today? What's happening with the diaspora? The diaspora is no longer, I think the diaspora is still largely pro-opposition, but it's not a given in the way that it once was before.
And let me say, you know, we're going to open it up for Q&A to the audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab, not the chat room, the Q&A tab, because it's easy for me to pick it up from there. But Chipo, let me ask this question, because as we sent out invitations to this conversation, a very good friend of mine, you know, smart senior policy analyst, runs a trade association, came back with a one-liner, you know, I've decided never to vote again. Yeah. And this is an educated person, very smart, very rational. Is withdrawal really apathy, or is it a rational reading of futility? You know, if your vote genuinely won't be counted fairly, isn't it just staying home? Isn't it just a clear-eyed decision rather than a lazy attitude? The woman who sends money home and tells her son not to join the protest, isn't that a rational judgment? And if it is, what should I say to this friend of mine?
You say to them that the problem with democracy is that it is the best out of a basket of terrible options that we have. Governance is difficult, right? And let me speak to my favorite one of the founding fathers of the US. When they were working on the Constitution, there's James Madison, who said, if men were angels, then we wouldn't need a constitution, right? They understood that even with their noble ideas of what they wanted America to look like, with this nobility, we could even look at it and say, if you and I went back and we were in government, and people that trust us might say, oh, they're educated, they're open-minded, they've traveled. But the problem is that you and I, we're not angels. We're still human beings. And in order for democracy to work, for any governance to work, you still need to put even your favorites accountable. So people always think about elections as holding the bad guys accountable. And I think, no, it's about holding the good guys accountable. And I say to most African voters, you know, we spend a lot of time thinking about the presidency, but where I want people to be thinking about is the local elections. The last time I was in Accra, a friend of mine says to me, there's a pothole that he's been seeing every time he comes home, and it bothers him. And he went to the city council, and on the table, this was a table of educated voters, and we asked people, who is responsible for this pothole in the town council? And none of them knew who they voted for town council. So when I vote in Zimbabwe or anywhere where I vote in the United States, my biggest concern is on the local election. It's who is responsible for the town council. And they get a free pass, right? Because often they are riding on the ticket of a party, of a political party. And when we think about corruption, so when I was thinking about corruption in Kenya, a lot of the corruption that actually is very detrimental in Kenyan politics is not up here. It's down here. There was a case where somebody was given money for an education project and they bought 80 single pens, 80 of these, 80, and justified that that's where the money went, right? So to your friend, I'm going to say, rethink it. You might be frustrated at the top, but what's happening at the bottom? And the bottom is a place where we can actually bring a lot of change. Can we run good people? Can we encourage good people to run at local election? Can we encourage good people to run for mayor so that they're selected for mayor? Local elections, because your everyday frustrations are not usually at the top. They're at the bottom of everyday politics. When you're driving past that pothole, when I was in Lagos, I found it so frustrating that on the highway, my little car is fighting for the road with the oil tankers. I mean, that's just really frustrating. Who is the person who is responsible for that section of the highway? So that's where, in some ways, our concern needs to be, right? Who's on the board of education? Because before our kids are educated enough to go abroad, they are being educated in the local systems, right? So
Exactly.
can we ask ourselves, who is responsible? So that's what I say to people. I say, don't give up on it, especially think local. If you think you can't change at the top, what can you do at the bottom?
So there's a question from Chinelo Chikelo. How then do we as citizens apply the insights from this book to ensure voting turnaround in Nigeria come elections next year? Is there any insight from your studies of what maybe citizens have done to encourage greater turnout, to increase that rigging margin, or to make it more difficult for rigging to happen, the buffer?
Yeah, I think you turn out, and especially for young people, you like to do things in groups, right? I think you got to make voting exciting. So I always say to young people, when I was a young college student in 2008, I graduated from college in 2008. The day I graduated, I left Oregon to go to Washington, D.C. And from Washington, D.C., a friend of mine asked if I would be interested in working in local elections. And we went to Colorado together where we campaigned for Barack Obama. We were just finishing college. We had very little by way of responsibility. I think my only financial responsibility at the time was they were paying for our rent, they were giving us food. My mother was paying for my phone bill. So I had no responsibilities, literally. So for 3 months, we spent it going door to door. You like to do things with your friends. You have, and I'm not saying you might not have the same commitment as I am. I think a lot of younger people today, you like to make more money than I ever did when I was that age. But I think get in the habit of getting your friends to register together. My friends in Harare know this. Last election, when I got to Harare, I made sure that everybody who's in Harare was going to the polls with me. And we've got WhatsApp, we've got those WhatsApp groups, use them. We've done a study actually with Lauren Young, who's at UC Davis, where we tried to see whether or not getting political messaging on WhatsApp groups from your friends would encourage voter turnout or voter registration. So we did this with elections in Zimbabwe, and we found that, people had an 80% increase in registering to vote if they got a message from their friend as opposed to getting a message from a political party. So people will block the messages that are coming from political parties, from the government, whatever. Nobody wants that on their phones. But if your friend was saying to you, hey, I'm going to register to vote, come with me. So the way we did the study is that there was a lot of funding that went into it, into identifying young people that had access to a lot of other young people. And then you make voter registration fun. It's the same problems in the US. You know that in the US, for us to get young people to vote, we have to give them pizza. Unfortunately, we have to say, come get pizza. There'll be music, there'll be water, there'll be juice, even. I have a 5-year-old, and I think most of the time, getting people engaged in politics is the same strategies that I used to get my 5-year-olds to go and take a bath.
And let's see if you've got the same strategy for the question Bright Oniovo Kuko, has. He says, and it's a slightly long question, for young Nigerians and others, migration is a rational response to economic hardship, health crisis, and shrinking political space. But collectively, mass departure has consequences beyond individual lives. The text frames exit as an alternative to voice when people stop voting/protesting and choose to leave instead. What strategies can be used to address this by making the young Nigerians see it collectively? You've kind of addressed it in the first, but I want to see if there's any additional thoughts you have.
Yeah, I think don't give up your voice, right? I think you are young, but you get older every day. And I think this is the thing that I try to tell young people is that maybe today you don't really care about the tax policy, you don't care about immigration policy, you don't care about all of this because you're 22, but you're not 22. So, you're getting closer to 23, getting closer to 24, getting closer to where you care about those things. So each time you read something that is frustrating about Nigerian politics, I want you to have a rebuttal. You should have a rebuttal. You should have a voice. You should, and it's very difficult, right? And it can be very scary. So I say start those conversations just with your friends so that you create your own collective ideology and ideological framework just among yourselves. I think one of the most frustrating things for Gen Zs is that we are coming to tell you what you should be caring about, but it needs to be the other way around. You need to tell us what you care about because this Chipo today is very different from the Chipo that went to work on the Obama campaign. I wouldn't do that today. I simply
Why?
wouldn't, right? And I haven't canvassed in a very long time. Like I'll canvass over the phone, but I simply don't have the time to
Time.
go and physically canvass that I did 20 years ago. I don't have it. Um, and I might have more financial resources today, but the resources that are actually needed to keep democracy alive are with the youth. So I
Mm,
think on one hand, we've mishandled how we talk about youth protests because we've made it look like it's a bad thing when it's not.
mm, mm. Okay, so I have a question from Eza Konobi, and I'm going to leave the first part, but the second part is I'm also concerned about the inclusion of diaspora voting in situations where the electoral system in the home country lacks clear and verifiable legitimacy. In such cases, adding external votes to an already questionable process may not necessarily improve its credibility or outcomes. What do you think?
Again, it goes back to, again, democracy is flawed, right? There is no perfect democracy, but you get closer to perfection if we can take control of who's participating in it. But remember also, voters think you don't have a voice. What do politicians care about? Politicians care about being re-elected, right? So, and I think a lot of times African voters, we think, oh, they're just going to win. Of course, they'll just win if they are able to just galvanize the people that are going to vote for them. But if you keep in mind that they are only there, even when there is rigging, but they are only there because a particular set of people voted for them, can you change that around? And again, it goes back to, I think, start at local elections if we think that top elections are very difficult. But once in a while, I mean, across the continent, I look at elections and I see exciting people being elected, but they need support. And one of the things that I think the diaspora should do is to fund our own democracy. Because the moment that the money is coming from big names or big sources, it makes it very difficult to change the behavior of politicians. And then people in the diaspora will say, oh, well, I don't want to give money. And I always say to people, you can afford to give $20. You can afford even if the politician steals your $20, you are not going to miss this $20.
Mm. Now, let picture like a young person in Harare, right? Or in Abuja, where I am today, or Nairobi, scrolling, deciding whether their future is in Nairobi, Kenya, Harare, wherever, or somewhere else. If you could sit across from such a young person, not as a professor, but as someone who made that same exact choice, what would you actually say to this young person?
Well, I'm
Leave
having these
or stay?
conversations every day. I am an aunt to 9 nephews and nieces who are between 20 and 30. And we're having these conversations every day, right? Especially, I have my niece who's in South Africa, where South Africa is becoming very difficult. She's studied at top universities in South Africa. She's got her degrees, she's got her skills visa. And one of the unfortunate things about this moment for young people is that your options of living seem broad, but they're actually more limited than when I was a young person, which is why I think it's so important for us to participate in local elections at home. It's quite unfortunate, even not just thinking as a professor, but as an auntie, where a young person graduates in the US, we used to be able to say, just apply for your OPT, get work experience in the US and
Yeah.
move. But
Yeah.
now even that option seems blocked, right? So people can't get OPT. The UK is making it very difficult for people to work. And for me, I see a danger where now families are looking at Eastern Europe. I get texts all the time, people saying, well, we just found the school in Belarus or in Russia or wherever. What do you think? And I say, well, have we forgotten what happened when the war in Russia and Ukraine started? Africans were some of the most violated people. So your generation, unfortunately, is limited in where you can go because of just the geopolitics of migration do not favor your generation, which is why I think the Gen Z protests we're looking at in Kenya are a good example of where young people need to be. You need to tell African politicians that Africa is not poor. And
Mm.
the fact that your generation is facing poverty when my generation, I think we were the luckiest, right? We grew up when things were a little bit more comfortable on the continent, and you people should be having a better life than we did. So we have to look at what Gen Z in Kenya is doing and saying to politicians, you can't be corrupt. It doesn't mean that, President Ruto is looking and paying attention, but you also have the power of social media. I have a student at Wellesley who's been helping me track corruption on Instagram. So one of the assignments I gave her is I'll give her some names of people that we think are getting a lot of money from nefarious places. And we trace whether they are giving away gifts, whether they are just posting on Instagram with like wads of cash, right? Which is very problematic. And so for me, I say, if I was Gen Z, I could probably do this in 2, 3 hours and see who are the big shakers and movers of African money. And you have that, right? You've got the data training, you've got the social media training, you've got the commitment, you have the evidence of the 30 or 40 hours a week that you spend online. So you really can do that and say to governments, this is unacceptable. And so, I think migration just isn't an option as it was before. And I don't, every day I struggle with this is, can we really send kids abroad in this climate?
Mm.
So even now, kids coming to the US, we just got a memo that if somebody visited Sudan or Uganda or whatever, then they can't come back to school in the fall.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
That's terrible. Anyways, so I have a question here from Jovia Gonza. How can the young people express their voice in systems where freedom of expression is constrained? Take the example of Uganda, where even peaceful protests are crushed with arrests, floggings, etc.
We have to think creatively about where to put the pressure. This is, and I don't want to keep harping on this, but I have a paper coming out with Brookings this week. And I think corruption is something that we can all talk about that crosses political lines, right? Museveni cares about corruption just as much as Bobby Wine cares about corruption. President Museveni will be offended if it becomes public knowledge that 10 people in his government keep coming up with this corruption. He doesn't want that, right? He doesn't want the corruption record because it impacts how they get money from the World Bank. And as somebody who's worked at the World Bank, I am telling you that conversations about corruption cut aid. China cares about corruption. I almost say to people, let's think about what is it that China cares about? What would stop China from investing in country X? And if there's one thing that China cares about, it's not human rights, it's not democracy, it's not elections, at least in the way that we frame it, but it is corruption. And what is the one thing that is costing young Africans opportunities and the ability to enjoy life in our countries? It is corruption. There's a professor from Burundi who has got this wonderful graph where he looks at how much money comes into the continent from aid and other avenues and how much money is lost through corruption. There's a case, I forget which leader it was, who died in Europe and they found a library. So they thought, oh, it's just books. No, it wasn't books. It was fake cases of money. And do you know where a lot of African money is? I don't know, those of you who've been to the US, I've been reading about how there are like neighborhoods in like Maryland, like Chevy Chase and others, where rich Africans just come and buy property and they bring suitcases of money. Like no country wants to be associated, one, with the argument that you're allowing corrupt money to come into your borders. No country wants that. Number
Mhm.
two, no government wants people to keep pointing out that you are allowing money to leave your borders. And I think this is something that Gen Z can do. It's not protesting on the streets. It's not necessarily breaking laws. I mean, this is something you care about. The other thing that I think is a form of voter exit, and if I, it's something I'm starting to think about, is drugs on the continent, right? We are losing a lot of young people because of drugs on the continent, and you people know who are the sources of that, and that's something you can speak about, right? About publicize. So your strategies need to change. The way I think of it is that in the 1980s, 70s, when they were fighting for independence for Zimbabwe, they were using very different strategies because it was pre-independence, right? In the 1990s, they were using different strategies. And so today you have to use different strategies. If going on the streets doesn't work, then don't go on the streets.
Mhm. And Chipo, there's a question here, to give the title of your paper that's coming out next week.
Oh yeah, it's from Brookings. Good question. I think I called it something like corruption is the biggest problem in Africa, but it's through Brookings, and I'll share it on my LinkedIn once it comes out.
Exactly. So there are a number of policymakers, civil society leaders who are listening right now, and they cannot stop people from wanting to leave, right? What is the actual lever they can use? Is it possible to make, say, domestic voice cheap enough, safe enough, and consequential enough that staying and fighting becomes the rational choice than the sacrificial one? And if yes, how?
Yeah, when I was in Lagos, teaching a class at NUTM, I asked my students to talk about local industries in Nigeria. And I came out of that conversation quite frustrated because most people don't know that in Nigeria, you've got all these companies that make local sneakers. It sounds like a frivolous thing, but when we think about what are the Nigerian industries, we think about oil, we think about, kind of these natural resources. But there were lots of young people in those classes that were leaving to work in those industries. So there are people that want to leave, but the majority of our people stay in our countries. How can we make it easier for them to stay? When I was in Lagos, the week that I was in Lagos, that's when the government introduced a new policy and I couldn't get money out of the ATM. It's small things like that where it's like, how can you make it so that when somebody goes to the ATM, they can get their money out of the ATM? You need to be able to do that, right? People need to be able to transact with their money. We need to create jobs for the thousands upon thousands of young Nigerians that are graduating. If people are able to make a living at home, they are not likely to leave. It's very simple, right? There are some people who like the excitement of going abroad and visiting, etc., etc. But I think the average young person wants to get a job that pays them well. They want a job that utilizes their skills well, and they want a job that pays them well. And I think that this is something that African policymakers can do, and they can do well because our people like the sort of things that people are buying abroad, these are things that can be made locally. I'm spending a lot of time in West Africa these days because of my work on chocolate. Why is it that 90% or is it 80% of global cacao comes from Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria? When I went to Belgium, I was stunned by how much money is made from chocolate. And yet we sell our cacao like for peanuts. There is no chocolate if there is no African cacao. China tried to make synthetic cacao. It did not work.
Mm.
It did not work. We need to be encouraging more Africans to be making, we are not people that eat chocolate. So the argument isn't that we should be making chocolate. No, but the argument is that we need to be thinking about how to scale up what we do well. And Africa does a lot of things well. And it truly is. So this is my issue with policymakers. Why are you selling our natural resources for such small amounts? With cacao, what actually struck me is that Colombia, which doesn't have as good cacao as we do, has very strict regulation on how their cacao is sold. And their cacao is sold almost 10 times more than ours. Why? And it doesn't make the best chocolate. Ours makes the best chocolate. You go to any chocolatier. I traveled last summer. I was in London, when England, when Belgium, when Paris, when Sweden, when Switzerland. All these countries I traveled for chocolate. It's all African cacao. It's all African cacao, and they get it for peanuts. And so we could be creating more jobs. I mean, Africa is just a very rich continent, extremely rich, that there is no reason, right? The way almost 60, 70 years post-independence of the first countries getting independence, that we haven't scaled up production in that way. When I look at Nigeria, I find Nigeria to be just fascinating. I mean, the biggest fashion shows are in Nigeria, right? And people want the arts and they're coming for that. Like, I cannot tell you how many times many of us are ordering dresses from Nigerian designers. So we know that there's a hunger, there's a thirst for that. Right now, people are talking whether it's TV shows that are coming from Africa, whether it's music that's coming from Africa. But the problem is that our policymakers are not thinking proactively. You're looking at the production on the continent and not investing in it. We're not investing. So, for example, I am so frustrated that not a single African government has put TikTok to task. They've not put TikTok to task to pay African content creators the way that they pay content creators elsewhere. And what we know is that a lot of African content is then stolen, right? And put on, and I'm not on TikTok, but it's stolen and then put on other platforms by people who are outside of the continent. And that generates the money. It's a lot of money that is being paid people from TikTok, from YouTube, from Twitter, from all of this. And African governments don't have policy. So I used to be the chair of Social Science One. And Social Science One, the goal was to look at social media policy, right, around the world. And I was chairing the Africa section of it. Africa did not have a social media policy. We were behind. We were waiting for Europe to come up with their own social media policy. Where is our AI policy? I just came back from policy discussions in DC. Do you know that someone sat in a room full of people and said that the problem with AI in Africa is that Africans are not trained on how to use AI? How is that something that someone is saying in today's world in front of policymakers? And it's because our own policymakers, our own ministers of technology are not. You
not
don't
in those
even
rooms.
need, yeah, they're not, it's not about those rooms though. They need to be in the rooms themselves, producing policy documents that then get circulated. This is Africa's AI policy. We have AI policy, we have AI knowledge. Our content is constantly being stolen. Look at the World Cup happening right now. Look at the World Cup. Look at where all the top players are from. I'm not talking about their nationality on the passports that they use, but I'm saying look at the origins of where all of these people are from. Are we investing in sport? I was at the University of Pretoria, which is an impressive, right, program for African sports. Where is the investment there? Why are we not training our own sports people? I mean, just look at the World Cup. It's African players. Look at the French team. It's all African
I
players,
knew
right?
you would go there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all look at the US, their top scoring person. So the fact that and I get so frustrated with African policymakers, and I almost say let's not talk about democracy, but talk about what are you people discussing in the boardrooms when you're in the boardrooms and you're looking at your citizens and you're looking at our talent and you're looking at what we're good at. What are you looking at? Even when I think about guest lectureships, right? And I always laugh at this because people will say to me, "Oh, we've invited some American guest lecturers to so and so African University." And I'll look at the list, not a single black face on there, not one. And so you've got these people talking to our young people who don't understand our young people, who don't have their interests at heart. And yet we are here. Most of the work that I do for African universities is unpaid, and maybe I need to change that model. But we're here and we care and we are concerned. And our policymakers are not thinking proactively about what to do. There is no global production without African natural resources. Literally, there is no global production without Africa. Zero. It does not exist. And yet our policymakers treat our natural resources as if they can be gambled. Look at what Nigeria is doing right now, what Dangote is doing with oil. Look at what he's doing with oil. Why was there not more investment in Nigerian oil when the war started? So the war is very bad. But the way I was looking at it, okay, is they're fighting in the Middle East. We've got oil on the continent. This is our time. South Africa should not be getting oil from the Middle East. Zimbabwe should not be getting oil from the Middle East. Zimbabwe should be getting oil from the DRC. We should be getting oil from Nigeria. So for me, it's truly that African leaders are not they're the ones that are not thinking proactively about what we have, because there is no global production without Africa. I mean, think about any natural resource, and I travel around the world. I was when I was in Ghana, something really surprised me: the quality of food in Ghana. And so you're thinking to yourself, well, where is the problem with this continent? Why are we not making use of what we have? Like, there is simply no global production without Africa. And yet our policymakers are giving away our natural resources willy-nilly. Or even in Nigeria, when I came to Nigeria last time and I was saying, oh, I would love to do some tourism. And someone said, oh, we don't really do tourism in Nigeria. So I ended up taking a boat, very questionable little boat, to some little questionable island. And it was that sort of boat that if it had capsized, I had my daughter with me and she was 3. And I was saying to myself, this is frustrating. This is frustrating. Africans love to have a good time. Why aren't we creating conducive environment? So, and I think we went to the lagoon. Some in Nigeria. I don't remember where it was, but it was almost $40 just to access the beachfront. And I thought, why? So, I mean, policymakers can look at academics and say, well, you're not writing this or that. But I think policymakers are not looking at the continent and really thinking that, especially at this time where there is global strife between the Middle East and the West, this is the time for Africa to maximize our own resources and to maximize the conditions under which our resources should be exported.
Sure. And there's a question on where can our viewers find more of your works? A website.
Yeah, my website. I used to be active on Twitter. I'm trying to make the argument that everybody should come back to Twitter, but nobody wants to come back on Twitter. I've just started using LinkedIn, which is not my foray. I write books, I write articles, I write for The Conversation, I write for Brookings, I write for I think we've got something coming out of The Guardian. So you will see, but where do I share the work? I will still share it on Twitter, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. I'm expanding where I share all my work. And I've got actually a Wellesley student who's updating my website all the time to make sure that conversations like this are posted on the website and you can see what else I'm engaged in. And I travel. So if you want to invite me to Nigeria, I will come to Nigeria. I mean, I haven't been to Nigeria in a while, so I like to travel and I bring my kid with me. We are going to be, so if some of your listeners are in South Africa, I'm giving a talk at Wits in the data on my website. I'm giving a talk at Wits. I'm giving a talk at Rhodes in July. And then we're spending the month in Australia. I'm giving a talk at University in Perth. I'm giving a talk at a university in Melbourne, and I'm giving a talk at a university in Sydney.
Fantastic, fantastic. Maybe just a few more questions before we run out of time. Beyond, and this question is from Chinelo Chikelo. Beyond the citizenry, how can journalists contribute to ensuring, even persuading young people who have given up on voting because their votes never count to not only vote, but also take interest in local governance administration? I picked this question because do young people still believe what they read? And if not, how can we re-engage young people to do believe? And I'm saying this in the context of the very significant trust deficit, that we have in the countries that we live in.
I think journalists need, a lot of what's coming out when it comes to young voters is very disparaging of them. And I keep going back to, if you're a journalist, I think it would be really cool to sit, have a conversation with them where they are. What do they care about? We've got a lot of young influencers who spend a lot of time talking online about issues that are important to them. Let me give you an example. I didn't know who Aisho Speed was. So last semester, I'm teaching my class on Introduction to African Politics. And they are asking me, are you following iShow Speed? Are you following iShow Speed? And I'm thinking, who's iShow Speed? So I look up iShow Speed and I thought, oh, how impressive. He had been to 27 countries. Not a single, and the articles that I saw written about him were quite disparaging, how he doesn't know the culture. This is a 22-year-old Black child, really 22, right? Who's been to 27 African countries in a week or 2 weeks or however. Not a single article thought to sit down with him and talk about what he saw across the continent. Not one. Number two, what I noticed is that in every country where he went, it didn't matter how remote it was. There were hundreds of young people following him because they had been following him on Twitter. Not a single journalist followed to ask them what they thought about this. The same thing is happening with the xenophobia much in South Africa. You don't see really Gen Z at these protests. And nobody's talking to the Gen Z and asking them, why are you not at the protest? What is it that Gen Z is thinking about? We write a lot about the protests in Kenya, elsewhere, but we're not hearing from the young people that are organizing this, what their thoughts are, where they want to take it. So I think for journalists, it's good to talk to somebody like me. It's good for somebody like me to write. But even in my own work, one of the things I'm starting to do is to write with my students, right? Not just to paste their name on a paper at the end, but to write collaboratively. Because if these are the voters, then we want them engaged, right? I'm thinking that young voters are looking at Mamdani, they're looking at the president in Senegal. There are all these people that they're looking at. And if we're not platforming those people, if we're not engaging with those people, if we're not going where they are, then we can't get them excited.
Mm, mm. And we're close to the last minutes of the conversation, but I wanted to cede some time to you. Is there something that you really want to talk about that we haven't gotten to in the conversation?
I get in trouble a lot with people when it comes to remittances because, I'm always thinking our remittances are surpassing FDI
Mm-hmm.
across the African continent. They are surpassing FDI. There are very few families that don't depend on remittances. But I wonder maybe we could look at the India example as a continent and think about how they have reimagined remittances. How instead of, I always say to people in the diaspora, you can build a mansion in Lagos or Accra or Harare or wherever that sits empty for years and years. Or we can reimagine how to use diaspora to leverage government behavior. And I think we are able to do that, right? I think we can put conditions on the government to say these are the sort of investments that we want. Ethiopia might be problematic, but it was the diaspora that really pushed forward. People love the Addis airport, right? That comes out of efforts and conversations with the diaspora. So I think the African diaspora, we have a lot to contribute to our countries, to the global community, and we need to listen, nobody is going to give us permission to speak. No one is going to give us permission to vote. If I'm a politician, it works better for me if you just don't vote and if you don't speak.
Interesting. And some of this reimagining of what we do with remittances, what are some of the ideas that are top of mind for you?
I think on top of mind, it's job creation. I think it's job creation. I think it is
So
making
maybe
it
investing,
easy.
maybe instead of just funding consumption, the diaspora should be looking to invest in production, so to
It's
speak, and
it's
then create
investing in
jobs.
production. It's maximizing. There was a time when people were working from home a lot, and international companies were looking to hire what they consider cheap labor in Africa. But I think our governments could facilitate some of that so that our young people have jobs, right, that are created elsewhere, but they're paid locally. And to make that easier for young people so that they stay. If the reason that they're going to England is for work, but if there's a company in England that needs the labor force, but they don't necessarily want us in England, can our governments facilitate that, right? So instead of just thinking about visas for people that are coming from abroad to stay in our countries and work, can we think about how to facilitate for young people that are working for these companies abroad? And in order for us to do that, we need to be thinking about how do you make internet cheaper, faster, effective.
Mm.
And then young people will stay. I think if you're a young person in Lagos right now, in this moment, there is no better place for you than being on the continent. When I think about it emotionally, mentally, I think there's no better place than home, right? And I say this as somebody who left. I say this as somebody who's been away from home for 20 years. And I think often about the emotional cost, the mental cost of living away from home. And I spent a year, so I moved back home for a year. And I can tell you that even my mental well-being was very different. What I needed was money in my bank account that I could still get from whatever work I was doing. But being at home, thinking about how we can invest, thinking about how governments can make it easier to register for companies, thinking about how we can fund small VC, VC funding for African governments who have African solutions. One of my colleagues who's an economist has been looking at the types of companies that get VC funding in Africa. You probably won't believe me, but she found that about 80% of those VC funded companies are not owned by Africans, even though on paper they say these are African countries. They're not. It's people from all over the world who have companies in African countries that get VC funding, and yet they are not Africans themselves. So I think rethinking where VC funding goes to and ensuring that it is actually going to the ideas of young Africans, right? Or middle-aged Africans, whoever, but that those ideas are well funded. I think that's something that we can rethink. I've actually been looking to see, hey, is there some big international guru person who's saying, hey, Diaspora, do you have $200 that you want to drop into this fund that we're using? For me, I think it's okay. If I lose the $200 as an investment, that doesn't bother me as much as is there such an idea that exists where our smart MBA trained people are saying, I've created a fund that I want to fund African VC projects, and we are collecting from the diaspora. If you're asking people to give $100, $200, it's a lot of money, but it's also not money that I'm going to lose sleep over if I lose it, right?
Exactly. Dr. Chipo Dendere, thank you so much. And for our ladies and gentlemen, the book is Death, Diversion, and Departure, Voter Exit and the Persistence of Authoritarianism in Zimbabwe. It's from Cambridge University Press. And if you care about why so many of our democracies survive against the wishes of their own people, you should definitely read it. Chipo, thank you for the rigor, the honesty, and the personal weight you brought to this conversation. And to everyone else listening, either here in Abuja, across the continent, and in the diaspora, thank you for spending this time with us. This has been next year's Development Discourse. Until next time, keep building the society we want to live in. Thank you, Chipo. Thank you, everyone.